By the time I parked behind the delivery bay, rain had begun to streak down First Street. The back stairwell smelled like rust and wet concrete. I buzzed in and started my usual morning crawl through the underground levels, half routine, half hoping nothing had overflowed or backed up overnight. My job wasn't glamorous. I kept things moving behind the scenes at Pike Place, below the postcard shops and fresh-cut tulips, below the fish throwers and Instagram crowds. Down in the sublevels, it was just chillers, freight doors, and loading schedules. I logged inventory, reset vendor access, kept the cold storage temps in check. And every now and then, someone stuck me with the weird jobs. Which is how I ended up checking on a forgotten unit near the end of the lower meat corridor. The door didn't match the others, older, set back slightly, with paint flaking around the edges. It didn't look used. I checked the label, Unit 54. Power log was blank since 2021. The access panel was dead, and the air around it had a weight to it, colder than it should have been for an inactive unit. Not freezer cold. Just still and heavy, like the air hadn't moved in a long time. I logged it as failed. Routine check. Probably disconnected years ago. The corridor itself was quieter than the rest of the level. The hum of compressors faded near the end, replaced by the subtle metallic tick of old pipework. A hook rail still ran above the hallway from the original meat runner system. Steel tracks vendors used to move hanging cuts before the new dollies and lifts took over. Most of the hooks had been pulled down years ago, but the mounting bolts and rust scars were still there. The line curved right past Unit 54 and kept going into the dark. I kept moving, knocking out my checklist, cooler readings, humidity balance, walk-in locks. Nothing flagged. Upstairs, Kyle was perched at the back desk chewing through a breakfast burrito wrapped in receipt paper. He had a way of looking helpful without ever doing anything, and management had long since stopped noticing. 54's dead, I said, setting the clipboard down. He blinked, mouth full. Which one's that? End of the lower row. Old meat corridor. Panels gone. No log since before the pandemic. Kyle nodded slowly, chasing it down with bad coffee. That was one of the Vietnamese butcher spots, right? I think it flooded once. Or caved in. Something sketchy. That whole hallway's borderline condemned, honestly. The lock's fried. You'd think someone would have pulled it. Kyle shrugged. Records from that era are screwed 6 ways. Nobody flagged it, right? I didn't push it. Just nodded and stepped back out into the hallway. The rain had started again, tapping on the ventilation louvers high along the back wall. I stayed late that night under the excuse of end-of-week freezer calibration. After hours, the sublevels felt even quieter. Elevators echoed louder. Everything smelled colder, like old metal and meltwater. I walked the corridor again. Unit 54 stood exactly the same, tucked beneath the overhang near the old hook line. I didn't touch it. Just stood close enough to feel that same strange weight in the air. I couldn't smell anything obvious, not rot, not freon, but something metallic lingered faintly. Like rust and wet coins. I turned to leave, scanning the rest of the corridor. Just as I reached the end, I looked back. The rail above 54 was moving. Not swinging, just shifting slightly, like something heavy had been hanging there a moment ago, and the tension had only now let go. Rain had already swept the lot outside, and my boots tracked a smear of water through the rear stairwell. Inside, the lights buzzed with that faint blue flicker they always had in bad weather, and everything smelled faintly of bleach and wet concrete. My badge reader failed twice before clicking green. The halls were unusually quiet. First Avenue had been cordoned off near the eastern ramp. Big tarped enclosures had gone up sometime in the night, and uniformed officers were already in place when I walked in. I recognized a few of them from the regular patrols, but their faces were different this morning, tight, deliberate. They weren't moving fast, but they weren't wasting time either. They'd locked down the central aisle, tents, zippered walls, full field lights mounted up near the ceiling grid. The investigators had rolled in overnight, forensics too. White suits and boot covers, gloved hands peeling back bags and bins from the rear of vendor 54. That's what was left of it. A mound of red-stained tarp sagged beneath the canopy, weighed down by more than one shape. I didn't count, didn't need to. The chatter said enough. Between the flesh, fragments, and whatever else they'd pulled from the surrounding bins, there had to be 4 or 5 bodies worth of mass. Raw meat, bone, tendons still clinging to hooks that hadn't been used in years. All of it dumped into view, like someone had just thrown it out with the trash. Vendors who showed up early were herded back. One of the butchers near the far corridor muttered something and dropped his knife on the floor. Blood pooled at the end of his glove. Nobody moved to pick it up. They sealed off everything east of the prep corridor by 7. Maintenance was told to stand down. Officially, it was an ongoing investigation. Unofficially, everyone with eyes had already seen enough to know this wasn't just some industrial accident or frozen stock gone bad. The freight hallway near Unit 54 was wrapped in tarp again, thicker this time, reinforced at the corners with heavy tape and backed by steel dividers. Cold poured out from under the edges and curled across the floor. One of the newer vendors told me she'd seen the forensics team pull something long and bent from the drain, wrapped in butcher paper. She didn't say what it was. She didn't need to. I finished my checklist with half my focus. Storage temps were normal. The mop closet still had a leak. Kyle was late again, probably intentionally. One of the camera techs from upstairs flagged me down near the west stairwell. "They're pulling the feeds," he said, without even asking how I was. "The whole east wing. They want backups if we've got them." "You think your system caught anything?" I shook my head, but promised I'd check the emergency logs. Behind the taped plastic, vendor 54 remained dark. No signage, no label, nothing on the current map. But it had power. The refrigeration coil near the ceiling still clicked on every 20 minutes, venting cold air into the hallway in steady intervals. The hook rail overhead hadn't been cleaned. Blood had run beneath it and stained the concrete along the edge. You could still see where it pooled. No one talked about it openly, but everyone had started giving that section of the building a wider berth. Even after the crime scene was closed off again, people detoured through the produce corridor just to avoid walking past. The chill had settled deep, and it wasn't just temperature, it carried weight, like humidity that stuck to your skin without heat. Kyle finally showed up around 9. He looked rough. Jacket unzipped, face pale, something tight in the way he walked. He asked me if I'd heard what was found in the drain behind the unit. I told him I didn't want to know. He nodded, like he'd expected that, and leaned against the back wall for a while without saying anything else. Later, a memo came down from operations. Just one line. All maintenance staff to avoid corridor G2 until further notice. Security presence increased. Do not remove tarp. No mention of bodies. No follow-up on the blood. Just a reroute and a quiet warning not to interfere. That night, I walked the empty western loading corridor and checked the camera feeds. My section hadn't recorded anything unusual, but one backup unit showed dropped frames around 3:41 a.m. Static where there shouldn't be static. 10 seconds lost. Right as the lights in that wing flickered. Nothing flagged in the official report. When I returned to my locker, something inside had changed. Not the contents, my gloves, my vest, my backup badge, but the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there. Sour and faintly metallic, like blood dried into cheap wood. I ran my hand across the liner. Nothing visible. I left it open overnight. The next morning, they brought in a specialist to review the refrigeration lines. Said they were trying to find the source of the residual cold. No leaks were reported. The coils were working fine. But the temperature inside that sealed corridor kept dropping, by half a degree each day. And no one knew why. I walked past the freight bay one more time before heading out. Someone had scrawled something across the plastic, marker or paint, too smudged to read. But it hadn't been there the day before. And the hooks overhead? They were still. But they hadn't always been. The days after the scene at the market blurred. The air felt bruised and slow, still carrying that sterile, chemical scent long after the tarps came down. A faint chill held to the lower levels, sharp enough to fog your breath in spots. It wasn't just damp anymore, it lingered like a pressure system that wouldn't lift. Laura took her usual loop earlier than normal, hoping to avoid conversation. Most of the vendors kept their heads low, organizing crates or fake reading their phones. A few nodded, but no one lingered. The stall near the sealed unit had been replaced with fold-out barricades and a warning sheet of plastic that shifted slightly with the draft. The cleanup crew was long gone, but no one had dared set up there again. The freight corridor ahead looked warped somehow, not visibly, just in the way it felt. As if the walls leaned closer together than before. A new sign had gone up, Maintenance Hold, in standard black font, but beneath it, someone had written in marker, Don't touch this time. Near the back, Kyle caught up with her, Red Bull in one hand, sunflower seeds in the other. His shirt was inside out, and he looked like he'd slept in his car. He muttered that the cops had returned overnight, pulling scrapings and walking the freight rails with a dog that refused to go anywhere near Unit 54. Then he veered off to check a leaking mop closet, leaving a trail of seeds behind him. By noon, Laura was alone again. She logged storage temperatures, flagged a delivery that never showed, and noted a second electrical flicker in the western corridor. When she passed near the freight ramp, her boots slipped slightly on a patch of damp concrete. The cold still pulled into her bones, even though the market above had warmed with midday foot traffic. She paused near the taped-off corridor and stared. The plastic sheeting shifted. Not from air vents, those had been shut off. It moved like breath, like something exhaling on the other side. Later, Laura combed through the system's log and pulled up the unit's temperature record again. The backup cold storage system, meant to track failures or power interruptions, still had that 5-hour blank space. She marked it and compared it to the other stalls. All the others were solid. No gaps. No errors. When she asked Kyle about it again, he looked up from a shipping manifest, blinked slowly, and said the system was old. Could be a relay issue or a cache drop. He offered a USB with stills from the night in question, sliding it across the table without another word. The images were mostly useless, grainy frames of empty corridors. But one caught her attention. At 2:14 a.m. Something stood just at the edge of a freight hall camera. It wasn't identifiable. A coat, long and dark, stood motionless. The head didn't look right. It leaned at a strange angle, and the light haloed around it in a way that looked warped, like the camera lens couldn't decide where to focus. Laura's skin prickled. No workers had been scheduled then. No deliveries. She was home. She didn't sleep much that night. She kept seeing rows of meat hooks, old industrial ones, the kind with teeth and jointed hinges that clattered when they swung. In her dreams, they hung in empty aisles, swaying in perfect rhythm. At work, her locker developed a smell like rusted water. Metallic, sour, almost like blood. She cleaned it twice. It kept coming back. By the end of the week, someone had zip-tied the plastic sheeting tighter over the door of Unit 54. No memo. No official note from maintenance. Just done in silence. Later that evening, as she walked past the sealed corridor, her footsteps echoed behind her, but not quite in sync. It was as if something heavier followed a beat behind. She kept walking, refusing to look back. That night, she used Kyle's admin code from an old clipboard and accessed the vendor archive system. It wasn't meant for normal use, buried behind outdated access layers. Vendor 54 had no tenant listed. No active lease. The record read simply, reinstated holding, 2001. Cold storage support remained active, with manual override locked. One note, bolded at the bottom, no mechanical entry permitted, review lock policy quarterly. She printed the record and slipped it into her bag. The following morning, a drain backup shut down the west corridor. The smell hit before the source was found, rotted meat and bile, thick enough to taste. Maintenance blamed it on fat buildup, but when they opened the drain cap near the meat hallway, what came out didn't look like grease. It was pale, fibrous, packed dense like soaked linen and something congealed. Laura crouched near the pipe and caught a glimpse of something inside. Coiled. Gristled. She didn't say what she saw. The others flushed it and sealed the drain again. After the cleanup, Kyle never returned. He texted once, saying he'd taken another job. Said the market felt off. She couldn't blame him. That night, an anonymous message hit her inbox. No subject. No sender. Just a single line, you missed something. Near the hook rail. IT flagged it as junk. She didn't. She waited until after hours. Lights were down, and the vendors had all gone home. The freight corridor was still sealed, but the air felt dense, too still, too close. She approached the plastic barrier and felt something behind it, a pressure like a held breath. One hook trembled above the taped-off section. No motion nearby. No draft. It ticked gently side to side, like a pendulum caught mid-swing. Beneath it, the concrete had darkened in a wide patch. Not wet, but stained, deep and set like blood soaked in over time and refused to come out. She didn't cross the barrier. Not yet. But something told her she would. The market felt hollow after hours, emptied out more than usual as the late shift began to dwindle. The usual hum of refrigeration units and distant chatter had faded into an oppressive silence, thick and still. The faint, lingering odor of rot and stale metal, something buried deep in the sublevels, hung in the air and seeped into the concrete beneath Laura's boots. She moved cautiously through the maze of service corridors and stacked pallets, the weight of the night pressing against her like a low tide threatening to pull her under. Somewhere behind her, fluorescent bulbs buzzed unevenly, flickering like the last gasps of a dying fire. Her eyes kept flicking to the handrail hooks overhead, imagining them swinging gently even when there was no breeze. The message in her inbox, simple and unsettling, looped in her mind. You didn't check the northwest ramp? She debated ignoring it. There was nothing left for her here. Kyle had vanished without warning, the others barely acknowledging her existence since the public horror at the market. Still, the urge to investigate gnawed at her, an itch beneath the skin she couldn't scratch. She knew the northwest ramp was part of the older delivery system, long disused and mostly forgotten except for occasional maintenance checks. The rusted metal signs and peeling paint along the way told stories of years gone by, when this place thrummed with life instead of falling to silence. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and pressed on. At the end of a narrow hall, tucked behind crates and abandoned pallets, she found it, a large industrial shipping container, locked but with a fresh padlock that gleamed unnervingly in the dim light. The floor around it was smeared with a dark crusted stain, dried and thickened in the uneven light, like some ancient scar left to heal but never quite fading. The air was colder here, biting deeper into her lungs with every breath. Laura reached out and jostled the lock. It wasn't rusted or weathered, but new and oiled as if someone had been here recently. A slow dread unfurled in her stomach, but curiosity outweighed fear. With a grunt, she levered open the container door. Inside, a weak flicker of a single battery-powered light barely cut through the darkness. The smell hit her instantly, an overwhelming blend of rot and old iron, sharp and sour and impossible to ignore. Sitting slumped against the far wall was a person, barely conscious, bound by ropes and straps. The victim's clothes were torn and stained, a ragged map of bruises and dark smears across their skin. Laura's breath caught as she recognized them, someone she had seen around the market, maybe a vendor who had disappeared weeks ago without explanation. Their shallow breathing was ragged and uneven, eyes flickering open and closed like a dying candle. Panic rose sharply. She dropped to her knees, fumbling with the bindings, trying to free them or at least make them comfortable. Her hands shook as she worked to untangle the ropes, her mind racing through what to do next. The person tried to whisper something, but the words were lost in a hoarse croak. Just as Laura moved to pull them forward, a faint red glow blinked in the corner of the container. She froze, the blood draining from her face. A small camera, barely noticeable but unmistakably watching. Her heart slammed in her chest. The realization crashed down hard. The entire scene was a trap. Someone had planned this, set it up so she would find it, so she would be caught on tape in the act of touching the victim. The way she had been pulling at the bindings, dragging the injured person out into view, it would look incriminating. She scrambled backward, her fingers fumbling with the container door to shut it, but it caught on something and refused to budge. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she realized she was the one being framed. A metallic scraping noise echoed faintly behind her, slicing through the silence like a razor through paper. She spun around, flashlight sweeping the corridor beyond the container's threshold. There, standing just at the edge of the dim light, was a figure, a tall, silent silhouette cloaked in the butcher's familiar dark apron. The outline was unnatural, the head tilted at an odd angle, almost as if it didn't quite belong on the shoulders it rested upon. No words were spoken, only that cold, unblinking presence that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. The light flickered and dimmed, casting shifting shadows that swallowed the hallway whole. Laura's breath hitched as the space around her seemed to constrict, walls closing in, the night suddenly thick and heavy. She grabbed the victim's arm and tried to pull them out, but their bodies sagged like a rag doll, too weak to rise on its own. The figure took a slow, creeping step forward, the scrape of metal following each movement with cruel precision. Panic seized her chest, sharp and raw, and she abandoned the struggling victim without a second thought. She turned and ran, her boots pounding the concrete as the scraping noise echoed relentlessly behind her, never quite catching, but never far away. Bursting into the brighter main corridor, she triggered a motion sensor light that bathed the space in harsh glare. Hard hammering, she slammed a security door shut behind her, fumbling for the freight elevator that would take her up to the administrative floors. The corridor was empty, silent except for the echo of her own footsteps and the persistent scrape of metal somewhere in the distance. No one appeared, no cameras blinked warnings. It was as though the container, and everything inside had been swallowed back into the shadows. Alone in the admin office, hands still trembling, Laura accessed the market's surveillance system. The footage from the container was missing, vanished without a trace. The small red light she had seen wasn't part of the official security setup. It was a private device, hidden and deliberately placed to capture her every move. She understood then, she was no longer just searching for answers. She had become the hunted, marked, and framed. As the night deepened outside, Laura sat motionless, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Kyle was gone, her coworkers had turned away, and the butcher was no longer a distant threat. Now, it felt personal. The moment I staggered back from the container, the darkened edge of the corridor seemed to move. I blinked once, and he stepped forward. The butcher. His outline warped in the dim fluorescence like the light couldn't agree with him. He filled the hallway without effort, a wide frame wrapped in a long butcher's coat slick with old, drying blood. And though the shadows blurred the details of his face, I saw him watching me. I ran. There wasn't time to think or plan a route. I just tore down the nearest hallway, skidding around the corner of a wet maintenance ramp, nearly slipping on the shallow runoff that always trickled from the broken pipe overhead. The sounds behind me weren't like footsteps, they were heavier. A dragging weight, punctuated by metal clanging against the walls. A grunt or breath bounced through the corridor behind me, too loud to be mine. I veered left and burst through the side door into the narrow storage junction behind vendor stalls. My shoulder slammed the frame on the way through, jarring my arm half numb. My shoes slapped wet tile as I bolted deeper into the maintenance warren. Pipes hissed above. Hooks rattled. From behind her came a crack, sharp and sudden, like bone under pressure, or wood snapping deep within the walls. I ducked into a side alcove and crouched behind a forgotten mop sink, trying to still my breathing, heart hammering in my throat. I waited. 30 seconds. Then a minute. The hallway stayed quiet. I eased up, hands braced against the wall, and turned back toward the central hall, just in time to hear the crash of a heavy body slamming through a plastic curtain 2 junctions down. The butcher had doubled back. He knew the shortcuts. I sprinted again. My legs burned. Every hallway started to look the same, and some wrong part of my brain told me I was moving in circles. Lights flickered above. Damp air clung to the inside of my mouth. I pushed through another loose curtain and nearly tripped on an overturned cart, then ducked beneath a hanging cable line as I cut across toward the western maintenance hall. It was only after the next corner that I spotted the knife. A broken prep station had been pushed against the wall near an out-of-use meat rail. On it sat a rusted boning knife, small, blade warped near the tip, forgotten or left behind. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, gripping the hilt so tight my palm ached. It wasn't much. But it was something. The air felt thick again, like the refrigeration systems in this section had failed entirely. Far ahead, the corridor curved. Past that curve was the freight floor, and beyond that, maybe an exit. I didn't make it. A chain-link gate screeched closed behind me with a heavy clank. I turned back and saw the butcher standing just on the other side of it, the gate between us, hands still resting on the latch. He tilted his head, not confused, not curious. Just slow, predatory recognition. Then he lifted a hook from his belt. Not a tool, something custom. Oversized. Barbed. He scraped it down the gate as I backed away. I didn't wait to see if he could open it again. I kept moving until I reached the prep zone just outside the sealed hallway of Unit 54. I wasn't sure how far I'd come, maybe only a floor, but my legs were ready to give. The lights here were low, flickering worse than usual. This was a part of the market we'd closed last winter for repairs, and it had never reopened. The smell of bleach and blood had been replaced with something older. Spoiled, but not food. Decay with intent. A kind of death that lingered. That's when I saw the wall. Spray-painted symbols. Strange, circular spirals, one of them dripping red. It hadn't been there the day before. Below it, someone had scratched deep grooves into the plaster, marks too clean to be random. At first I thought they were just slashes. But when I looked again, I saw they formed a number. Something shifted in the shadows behind me. I turned knife up, but no one was there. Just overhead, a chain hung low. The hook attached to it wasn't standard. It was old, tarnished, but sharp, like it had been cleaned and honed for something specific. My stomach sank as I realized where I was standing. Just adjacent to the back rail that curved past the sealed corridor. The same spot mentioned in the message. You missed something. Near the hook rail. The butcher hadn't been trying to kill me. Not yet. He'd been moving me. Hurting me. I stepped back from the wall, turned toward the opposite hallway, and heard the gate behind me crash open. He was coming again. And this time, I had nowhere left to go but down. I gripped the rusted knife tighter, backed into the shadows, and prayed the map of this place lived in my muscles better than it lived in his. The hallway behind me thundered with noise. Not footsteps, something worse. The sound of steel scraping tile, a hook against concrete, boots grinding through slick runoff. My shoulder slammed into the far wall as I pushed myself down another passage, legs aching, lungs trying to lock up under the cold. I moved by instinct now, not memory. Everything smelled like metal and mildew and old blood. The overhead lights had mostly gone dark in this stretch, leaving only the low wall sconces, half choked with dust, to outline the path ahead. I passed an emergency junction box and thought about turning back to flip the breaker, flood the corridor with light, maybe blind him or throw him off, but the sound of the gate crashing closed behind me killed the idea. He was moving fast now. Faster than before. Whatever patience the butcher had shown in those early moments, hurting me, shaping the chase, it was gone. He wasn't circling anymore. He was coming. The walls turned familiar again. White tile half stripped of its sealant, a door with the faded stenciling scratched halfway off, maintenance staff only. I shoved it open and stumbled into the locker room. It had once been sterile, organized, kept in line by clipboards and inspection sheets, and someone's rotating playlist of early 2000s alt-rock. Now it stank of abandonment and mold. The lights buzzed overhead in staggered rhythm, flickering just enough to give the illusion of movement in the periphery. Rows of rusting lockers lined the far wall, many hanging open like broken teeth, others sealed shut with bent hinges and wedged shoes. Water seeped beneath the tiles from somewhere I couldn't see. Every step sounded too loud. I cut across the room and ducked behind a bench, chest tight, gripping the knife so hard it bit into my palm. For a second, I let myself believe maybe I'd lost him. Maybe the mess of corridors and blocked gates had finally bought me enough ground. Then the door behind me groaned. Slow. Heavy. He entered the room with the weight of someone who didn't care how much sound they made anymore. No longer hiding. The fluorescent tubes over the entryway buzzed once, then died with a pop, leaving his silhouette standing just inside the threshold. His coat shifted as he moved, a whisper of fabric soaked through in dried streaks. The hook dragged behind him. Not clutched or readied, just carried, like a part of his arm. I pressed myself low, crouched behind the bench. The air in the locker room was colder now, pulled down by whatever presence followed him like a shadow. My breath fogged in front of me. The tiles beneath my hand felt colder than ice. The chill wasn't just atmospheric anymore. It felt alive. The butcher paused halfway into the room. I heard the sound of metal tapping metal. He was checking lockers. One by one. Not flinging them open, just pushing gently, waiting for them to creak, listening to the sound each made. The controlled patience of it made my stomach churn. He was hunting by sound. I stayed low and crept along the far edge of the lockers, trying not to breathe. The blade in my hand wobbled with each movement, the rusted edge smearing flakes into my grip. It wasn't going to help much. Not against something like him. But I kept it anyway. He passed just 2 rows over. I could hear the slick shuffle of his coat brushing against the metal, the low exhale through his nose, like an animal tasting the air. He stopped. I froze. He turned slightly, the hook clinking against the ground, and tilted his head toward the bench I'd just abandoned. The lights over him sputtered, once, twice, then went still. He knew I was in the room. I crawled fast and low toward the back hallway. There'd once been a secondary exit here, mostly used by cleaning staff, but I couldn't remember if it had ever been fully cleared after the last flood. I found it half-sealed in plastic tarp, old signage peeled from the wall, and a caution cone laying on its side nearby. Still, the door had a push bar. I pressed my shoulder into it and pushed. Nothing. Stuck. I tried again. Harder. My legs screamed. The bar groaned, but the mechanism inside wouldn't give. Behind me, a metal locker clanged open and slammed shut. Then another. Then footsteps again. I didn't scream. Didn't cry out. I braced my shoulder and shoved one final time, and the door cracked open just enough for me to wedge through. I stumbled out into a narrow side hall, one I didn't recognize, and kept running. This hallway felt older than the others. Not just aged, forgotten. The air had a stillness to it that felt unbroken by years. The floor was warped, cracked beneath footfalls, and the ceiling tiles sagged under old leak stains. Someone had spray-painted arrows across the right wall years ago, most faded, but one still pointed forward, marked with a half-erased word I couldn't make out. The air grew colder. Not ambient cold. Something worse. Like standing near an open freezer door in a room that shouldn't have electricity. The lights above this hallway weren't working at all, but a weak green glow pulsed somewhere far ahead. Not rhythmic. Not natural. Like an emergency beacon running on dying batteries. I pushed forward, knife held low, every muscle screaming from the sprint and the crash and the blind panic that still hadn't left me. I passed a collapsed stack of old shelving, then ducked beneath a row of overhead wires where a chunk of drywall had peeled open. The sound of metal returned, not footsteps this time. A dragging scrape. The butcher had found another way around. I reached the source of the green glow and found it coming from a cracked LED mounted above a steel doorway. The door itself had no signage, just a recessed handle and a faint humming sound behind it, like refrigeration coils kicking on and off. I didn't have time to think. I pulled it open and slipped inside. The room was colder than the hallway. Not freezing, but wrong. Like a walk-in fridge left sealed for years, then powered on just enough to keep the mold from blooming. There were shelves stacked along the walls, but they weren't organized, just metal trays and blood-stained linens. The back wall had a deep sink. On the far side of the room, under a yellowed tarp, something long and low had been strapped to a gurney. I backed away from it. I wasn't ready to see what was underneath. The door behind me clicked. I turned just in time to see the butcher step inside. He closed the door with one hand, hook in the other. The moment the butcher lunged forward, the rusted hook rail swung down like a guillotine, its heavy chain creaking in protest. I barely had time to brace myself, the impact throwing him back with a violent clang that echoed through the cold, stale air. His coat caught and tore on the jagged metal, the hook clattering to the floor somewhere behind him. He snarled, stumbling but not defeated, his breath ragged and wet in the silence that followed. The air was thick with dust and the sharp scent of rust and old blood. I pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering but mind sharp. Every second stretched, every sound amplified, the distant drip of water, the faint hum of forgotten refrigeration coils, the shallow scrape of the butcher recovering from his fall. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate despite the pain, eyes glinting with a terrible calm. I gripped the boning knife tighter, ready to fight again, but I didn't want to get close. Not yet. There was something about the way he moved, like a predator learning its prey's limits, measuring me for a final strike. I edged forward, watching the hook rail above. The chain still swung slightly, whispering in the stale air. My breath steadied as I planned the next move. If I could force him closer, if I could make him trip on the debris scattered around the floor, then maybe I could use the rail again. Maybe this time, I could end it. A sudden crash behind me made me spin around. The gurney beneath the tarp had fallen over, spilling its macabre contents in a messy heap of blood-stained linens and cold metal. The sound startled him. He lunged with a guttural roar, but I sidestepped, slashing the air with the knife. The blade barely grazed his coat, but it was enough to buy me space. The chase resumed, down narrow corridors slick with old water, around corners dripping with rust and mold. Every footfall was a test of balance, every breath a gamble between fight and flight. The butcher was relentless, the weight of his steps shaking the floor beneath me. I pushed toward the rail again, praying it would hold. Ahead, A long corridor stretched out, lined with metal hooks hanging from chains, forgotten relics of this decrepit place. I dove behind a crumbling wall panel as he thundered past, then sprinted out, grabbing the nearest chain. The hook swung wildly, but I held on, yanking with every ounce of strength. The butcher turned just as I let go, and the heavy chain snapped forward like a whip. The hook caught his collar, dragging him off balance. He crashed into the wall with a sickening crack, and I followed up, slashing and stabbing with desperate fury. His coat tore away, revealing mottled flesh beneath, dead skin stretched tight over something unnatural, something wrong. But his eyes were still burning with hatred, still alive with menace. Then, the sound of sirens pierced the silence, far off at first, then growing louder. The authorities had arrived. With a final burst of energy, the butcher lunged at me, but the chain wrapped around his arm caught tight, and he stumbled, collapsing to the floor with a groan. I scrambled back, gasping for breath, as flashing lights flooded the hall and voices called out in the distance. The door burst open. Officers poured in, weapons drawn, but I raised my hands and stepped forward, exhausted but alive. Questions followed, dozens of them, relentless and pressing, as if unraveling the threads of a nightmare could somehow undo the terror. Under harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered like a dying insect, I laid bare every detail: the blood-stained rooms, the barricaded halls, the butchered bodies hidden behind layers of rot and mold, each discovery a brutal punctuation mark to the story I never wanted to tell. My voice wavered sometimes, but I forced myself to speak, because the truth was all I had left. The officers listened, faces grim but slowly softening as the puzzle pieces fit together. Disbelief gave way to cautious understanding, and finally, relief. They cleared my name. I was no suspect, I was a survivor, a witness to something monstrous that had lurked in the shadows far too long. The weight on my chest eased a fraction, but the images, the vivid stains of blood on tile, the sickening smell that seemed to linger still in my nostrils, would never fully leave me. The butcher, subdued at last, was taken away under heavy guard. He didn't resist. His silence was worse than any scream, a void of menace in a body that still radiated dread. As they moved him through the empty halls, the oppressive cold that had settled in the bones of the market seemed to loosen its grip. The dreadful quiet was replaced by the low murmur of cleanup crews tearing down walls, investigators gathering evidence, and the distant rumble of machinery stripping away decades of decay. It was as if the building itself was exhaling, releasing its poison with every clatter and bang. Cleanup was thorough and grueling. The floor beneath the butchered remains was scraped and disinfected until the red stains faded to a dull pink, then vanished. Yet the memory of those gruesome bodies, their torn flesh, the unnatural angles of broken limbs, the smell of iron and death, would haunt the space long after. I walked through the market one last time before they sealed it off, the halls echoing hollow without life, the air sterile and empty. Every shadow seemed to whisper secrets, but now I held the power to silence them. Days later, outside the barricaded entrance, I watched the sun rise over cracked pavement and crumbling concrete. The market stood silent, condemned, a monument to horrors hidden beneath its surface. The world around it had moved on, indifferent in its bright morning light, but I felt changed, hardened, marked by everything I had seen and done. The faint breeze carried the scent of fresh air and distant pine, and for the first time in weeks, I breathed without the weight of fear squeezing my lungs. The shadow of what had happened lingered, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in the quiet moments between one heartbeat and the next, but the strength I had clawed from despair settled into my bones like a shield. This place had tried to swallow me whole, but I had fought back, faced down the darkness, and survived. That was my victory. Now it was over.